In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to create a modal pop-up box using the Dittofi app builder. To start off with, I'm going to come to this components section here, and I'm going to search for the if component that I've got here. I'm going to add this component to the screen. What you see when you add this component to the screen, if you go to the navigator, is that the if component consists of a couple of subcomponents. You've got a then component and an else component here. If I take a look in the HTML view, I can see the same thing. I can see my main kind of if component there, and then I can see I've got a then component and an else component. In the then component, you can see we've got some text which says displayed when your condition evaluates to true. And in the else component, you can see we have some text saying displayed when your condition evaluates to false. If I click on the main if component here, and go to the component properties panel under the cog on the right hand side, you can see that the main property we have to set is the condition property here. This condition allows you to enter some kind of condition which will either evaluate to true or false. And if the condition that you enter evaluates to true, then will be displayed the then section here. And if it evaluates to false, will be displayed the else section here. To show what I mean, if I click on this if component here and then enter in a condition 1 equals 0, like so, you can see now the text says displayed when your condition evaluates to false. So it's displaying this section in the else section here. If I go back though and change this to 1 equals 1, which we know is true, then we can now see this updates to say displayed when your condition evaluates to true. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to apply some initial styling to my page in order to build a kind of modal pop-out box layout. And then I'm going to use this if component here in order to conditionally display that modal pop-up. So if I go to this div block to start off with, and then go to the styles panel here and scroll down to the position section, I can switch the position here to fixed. And then if I set top, bottom, left and right all to 0, this will create a full size div block in the middle of the screen. I can then come to this background color section here and give this a background color like so. Maybe like something like that, and then I can scroll up to the display section, switch its display to flexbox, and set align and justify to centrally align this span that I've got here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab another div block, so I'm going to replace that span with that div block here, and then I'm going to put another div block inside that div block, and then clone it by going edit, clone here. If I look in the navigator now, you can see I have my full screen div block here, and then inside that I have this central div block with these two child ones inside it. This central one here is going to become the body of our modal pop-up box. So on this parent div block here, I'm going to give this a fixed width of 30%, so it takes up 30% of the screen. Or maybe I want to make that a bit wider, something like 40% of the screen, like so. And then I'm going to scroll down to the background section and change its color to white. So we now have this central white box in the middle of the screen. In this top div block here, I'm going to come and add a span, like so. And for the text, I'm just going to put in a cross. And this can become the kind of cross to close down my modal pop-up box. On this top div block here then that contains that cross, I'm going to set the display to flex, set justify to right, and then put a bit of padding on each side of this. Something like that. In the central div block here, I'll add some more padding as well to all sides. If you want to add padding to all sides at once, a little trick is you can hold down the shift button on your keyboard and then just drag this up and down, and it will add padding on all sides of your box at the same time. I'm then going to go to the component section here and just add a paragraph in here, and this can become kind of like the center of my modal box here. On the outside one, I could come and add a border, maybe 1 pixel, give it a color, let's say of something like this, and maybe add like a small radius as well, so we can see a kind of border radius around the outside. And I could add the same border actually along the bottom of this top block here in order to separate this top section from the main body of the pop out. So you can see now we have a kind of basic modal looking pop out box in the center of our screen. If I come back to the main if component that we're looking at the start and update its condition here, so it says 1 equals 0, we'll see that this central then component now is no longer being displayed, and instead we're displaying this else component. What you can do is you can actually come and just delete the else component like so. Now when the if block has a condition that evaluates to true, you're going to see the modal pop up in your screen, and when it's evaluating to false, you're going to see nothing. So at this point we have a kind of pop-up box that we've created. The way we want this to work in reality is you want to click a button and then have that pop-up box display. So I'm going to just add a button to the center of my screen just to demonstrate how this works. In this button, I'll just double click on it here and change the text to say show modal. What we need to do now is we need to create a workflow which basically is responsible for displaying this if component's contents on the screen whenever we click on the modal box. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to go to the variables tab here. I'm going to add a variable which I'm going to call show modal. I'm going to set the kind to checkbox and leave the initial value as false and just hit save. I'm now going to go back to my if component here, go to its condition, and then set the condition to the show modal variable that I just created. So now whenever this variable contains a true value, we're going to display the pop-up, and whenever it contains a false value, we're going to hide the pop-up. So what I need to do now is I need to go to the workflow tab and create a workflow which allows me to toggle this particular variable to true or false. So I'm going to go to this workflow tab and create a workflow here called show modal, like so. Save that and just add one event, and that event is going to be this set field event. If I come back to my variables tab here, I'm going to add one other variable here, which I'm just going to call true checkbox. And this is going to be just a constant variable we create, which contains the value true. I could create another one here called false checkbox, and this could be another kind of constant variable that we create, which just contains the value false here. In my workflow then, in my set field workflow, I'm going to pick the show modal as my variable, and I'm going to pick the value as the true checkbox. So now when this workflow runs, it will set the value of show modal to the value of true. I could create a second workflow here called hide modal, and I could add a set field event again. I could set the variable here to the show modal, and then I could set the value to the false checkbox that we created. So when this runs now, the show modal variable is going to be set equal to false. And when the show modal one is run, the show modal variable is going to get set equal to true. So it's going to get set equal to true checkbox that we created, or the false checkbox that we created here. So now on my show modal button here, if I come to the little lightning bolt icon here, go add workflow, set the trigger to on click, and then pick the show modal option. If I now regenerate the code and try this out, what we should see is when we click this show modal button, it will run the show modal workflow that we've set up here. And that show modal workflow will just toggle our show modal variable to true, which will then mean that our condition that we set up here is true, which means we will then display the contents of this then block here. In other words, show our modal box. So if I come here now and click show modal, you can see we have the pop-up box displaying on the screen. If you wanted to hide this pop-up box now, you could attach the hide modal workflow to the cross here, for example. But for now, this concludes the video on how to create a simple modal pop-up box using the Dittofi app builder.